The autumn of 1847 arrived at Ashworth Estate, clothed in mist and melancholy, the kind of season that seemed to weep silently over the fading glory of summer's warmth. Dawn came late and reluctant those October mornings, casting the great house in shades of pearl and shadow, its countless windows reflecting a sky uncertain whether to yield fully to day or cling stubbornly to the retreating night. It was in this liminal hour, when the world held its breath between darkness and light, that Eleanor Hartley made her daily approach to the servants' entrance, her footfalls quiet against the worn flagstones that had known 3 years of her passage. The path she walked was narrow and unremarked, tucked away from the sweeping drive, where carriages bearing ladies and gentlemen of rank would arrive in splendid procession, its stones smoothed not by grandeur but by generations of labor, by maids and footmen and tradespeople who understood instinctively that there were doors meant for them and doors forever closed. Eleanor knew those stones intimately now, could navigate them in near darkness by memory alone, her slight figure wrapped against the morning chill in a cloak that had been mended so many times it bore the history of her frugality in careful stitches. She was 24 years old, though the gravity in her dark eyes suggested someone who had long since set aside the frivolities of youth, someone who had learned that dignity could be worn like armor, even when one's dress was plain and one's hands bore the telltale calluses of constant needlework. As she approached the weathered oak door that had marked the boundary of her world for 3 years, she felt, as she always did in this moment, a curious mixture of pride and resignation, the knowledge that beyond the green baize door lay rooms of breathtaking beauty which she had helped to adorn but would never truly inhabit. Her fingers, elegant despite their roughness, had stitched the delicate embroidery on the drawing-room curtains, had repaired the precious lace on the Dowager Duchess's evening gowns, had transformed ordinary fabric into objects of such refinement that ladies exclaimed over them without ever wondering at the hands that had created such beauty. This was her gift and her burden, to move invisible through spaces of magnificence, to create loveliness she could admire only from the margins. Yet there was something in Eleanor that refused to bend beneath the weight of her position, a quiet self-possession that showed in the straightness of her spine, in the way she met the world, with eyes that neither challenged nor cowered, but simply observed with clear, unflinching honesty. She understood the boundaries that separated her from those she served, understood them with a precision born of necessity, yet she navigated them with a grace that suggested she had not surrendered some essential part of herself to the hierarchy that governed every breath within these walls. Adrian Ashworth, the Duke of Thornfield, had returned to his ancestral estate 6 weeks prior, though the house still seemed to hold its breath around him, and uncertain whether his presence signaled restoration or merely a different shade of absence. He was 30 years old, but carried himself with the weariness of someone who had seen too much of the world's duplicity, his handsome features marked by a remoteness that had not been present before his 2-year sojourn abroad, before the scandal that had driven him from England's shores, with his faith in human nature shattered like so much fine crystal against stone. The household staff spoke in whispers about the change in their master, how the easy charm that had once characterized the young duke had been replaced by a courteous coldness, how he moved through the rooms of Ashworth with the air of a man performing duties rather than inhabiting a home, how his rare smiles never quite reached his grey eyes. Yet on this particular October morning, standing at the window of his study while the household still slumbered, Adrian found himself watching the courtyard with an attention he could not fully explain, his gaze drawn to the slight figure, making her way through the pre-dawn gloom toward the servants' entrance. He had noticed her before. This seamstress, whose name he had learned was Eleanor Hartley, had observed the peculiar grace with which she navigated the narrow path, the way she held herself with a dignity that seemed incongruous with her station, as if she carried some private certainty that neither rank nor circumstance could diminish. There was something in her bearing that unsettled him, that penetrated the careful indifference he had cultivated since his return, though he told himself his curiosity was idle, meaningless, the simple observation of someone with too much time and too little purpose. His bitterness ran deep, a poison he had drunk willingly after Vivienne Cartwright had proven that even the most ardent protestations of love could be performance, that private confidences could become public entertainment if the price was right, that he had been valued not for himself but for the prestige his title conferred. Yet watching this unknown woman cross the courtyard, Adrian felt something stir beneath the carefully maintained ice around his heart, an unwilling interest he resented even as he acknowledged its presence. Later that same day, as he made his way through the east corridor on some forgotten errand, he encountered her a brief, charged moment when Eleanor emerged from the linen room and nearly collided with him, her arms full of fabric, her eyes widening in alarm at the unexpected proximity to the master of the house. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second, hers dark and startled, his cool and assessing, and in that instant, Adrian registered the intelligence in her expression, the proud set of her shoulders, even as she immediately lowered her eyes and stepped aside, murmuring an apology so quiet he almost didn't hear it. She was past him before he could respond, disappearing around the corner with swift, silent steps, leaving him standing in the corridor wondering why such a brief encounter had left him feeling as though something significant had occurred, as though he had glimpsed something rare and true in a world that had taught him to trust nothing and no one, least of all the evidence of his own treacherous heart. The summons came on a grey November morning, when frost still clung stubbornly to the window panes, delivered by Mrs. Hartwell with an expression that mingled approval and concern, informing Eleanor that the Dowager Duchess herself had requested her presence to undertake the restoration of a priceless heirloom wedding veil that had been worn by Ashworth brides for 3 generations and now required the most delicate of hands to repair the damage time and careful storage had failed to prevent. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with both honor and apprehension as she gathered her finest needles and most precious silks, understanding that this commission would require her to work, not in the familiar confines of the servants' sewing room, but in the family's private chambers, crossing boundaries she had spent 3 years carefully respecting, entering spaces where she did not belong, except by explicit invitation and temporary necessity. The Dowager's sitting room, when Eleanor was ushered into it by a footman whose expression revealed nothing, was a symphony of quiet opulence that made her acutely conscious of her plain dress and work-roughened hands, all pale blue silk wallpaper and gleaming mahogany furniture, portraits of long-dead Ashworths gazing down with aristocratic indifference, the very air seeming to carry the weight of privilege and history. She stood uncertainly near the door until the Dowager, a handsome woman of perhaps 55 with iron-grey hair and shrewd hazel eyes, gestured her forward to examine the veil spread across a velvet-covered table, and Eleanor forgot her discomfort the moment she saw the exquisite lace, her professional assessment immediately noting the delicate Valenciennes work, the places where the fine threads had begun to separate. The challenge and privilege of touching something so precious. She was bent over the veil, her fingers tracing the pattern with reverent care, her mind already calculating the hours of painstaking work required when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Adrian Ashworth standing in the doorway of what had been his late mother's sitting room, his expression startled and then carefully neutral, the air between them suddenly charged with an awareness neither could name, but both felt like a physical presence. The Dowager had apparently stepped out momentarily, leaving them alone in a silence that seemed to pulse with unspoken questions, and when Adrian spoke, his voice was curt, almost harsh, asking what she was doing in these private quarters, though Eleanor sensed the curtness was directed more at his own reaction to finding her there than at her presence itself. She explained about the veil with careful respect, her eyes properly lowered, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart, and she felt rather than saw him move closer, drawn despite himself to examine her work, his gaze falling on her hands as she demonstrated the technique she would use for the repair. "Your hands are quite elegant," he said, the words seemingly surprising him as much as they startled her, and she looked up to find him studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his grey eyes revealing a vulnerability that contradicted the studied coldness she had observed from a distance. She should have remained silent, should have accepted the compliment with a murmured thank you and returned her attention to the veil. But something in his expression, some loneliness that echoed her own, loosened her tongue, and she found herself speaking with unguarded passion about the craftsmanship of the lace, the skill of the long-dead artisan who had created such beauty, the profound satisfaction of preserving something precious for future generations. Adrian listened with an attention that seemed to reach past her words to something deeper, and for a moment she forgot entirely the gulf between their stations forgot everything, except the connection sparking between two people who recognized in each other something rare and true, until the sound of the dowager's returning footsteps broke the spell, and Eleanor retreated instantly into the proper deference her position required, though not before she saw in Adrian's eyes something that looked remarkably like wonder, as if he had discovered something unexpected and infinitely valuable in the last place he had thought to find it. The following weeks brought an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through even the thick stone walls of Ashworth, and Eleanor found herself working on the delicate veil in the warmth of the morning room, where the Dowager and Lady Beatrice often received callers, her fingers moving with practiced precision through the intricate lace, while around her swirled the polite conversation of ladies discussing charitable endeavors and social engagements, their voices a familiar backdrop to her concentration. She had grown accustomed to her peculiar position in these gatherings, neither quite servant nor quite guest, occupying some undefined space that required constant vigilance to navigate properly, yet she could not help but notice how often the Duke found reason to pass through these very rooms during the hours she worked there, his tall figure appearing in the doorway with some question for his stepmother about estate business or some document requiring Lady Beatrice's attention, his presence causing a subtle shift in the atmosphere that Eleanor felt like a change in air pressure before a storm. The small attentions began so gradually that she told herself at first they meant nothing, that she was reading significance into simple courtesy, but when a footman arrived bearing a tea tray specifically for the seamstress on a particularly cold afternoon, Mrs. Hartwell's raised eyebrow and knowing glance suggested that others had noticed what Eleanor tried desperately to dismiss. Then came the morning when Adrian paused beside her work table, ostensibly examining a set of damaged tapestries that hung in the adjacent gallery, and asked her opinion on their restoration, in his tone casual, but his eyes intent, as he listened to her explanation of the historical techniques used in their creation, her knowledge drawn from her father's extensive library and her own years of study, and she saw surprise flicker across his features, followed by something that looked remarkably like respect. The Dowager observed these interactions with a shrewdness that made Eleanor acutely self-conscious, though when their eyes met across the room one afternoon, the older woman's expression held neither disapproval nor censure, but rather a thoughtful consideration that seemed to weigh possibilities against probabilities, as if she was solving some complex equation whose variables included her stepson's happiness and the rigid mathematics of social hierarchy. Eleanor's internal state grew increasingly tumultuous as the days passed, and the weight of Adrian's attention became impossible to deny or dismiss, her heart beating faster whenever she heard his footsteps in the corridor, her awareness of his presence in a room as acute as if he carried his own source of heat and light. Yet she scolded herself fiercely for the traitorous hope that flickered to life, despite all reason and propriety, telling herself that she imagined the way his gaze lingered on her face, that she projected her own impossible feelings onto his simple kindness, that a duke and a seamstress inhabited different worlds as surely as the stars inhabited different spheres, and any thought of crossing that divide was not merely impractical but dangerously foolish, the kind of fantasy that could only lead to heartbreak and ruin. The December afternoon had turned the formal gardens into a landscape of silver and shadow, when Eleanor, having completed her work early on the Vale and seeking a moment of solitude before returning to the servants' quarters, had happened to glance through the morning-room windows and saw Lady Beatrice standing beside the frozen fountain in obvious distress, her posture rigid with discomfort, as a gentleman Eleanor recognized as Lord Pemberton's son leaned far too close, his hand grasping her arm with presumptuous familiarity that made Eleanor's blood run cold with recognition of a situation no young lady should endure alone. She did not pause to consider whether intervention lay within her authority, or whether crossing into the garden constituted an inappropriate breach of her position, driven instead by an instinct that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with fundamental human decency. And she moved swiftly through the side door and across the frosted grass, her approach drawing the young man's attention and causing his expression to shift from predatory confidence to irritated surprise. "Lady Beatrice," Eleanor said with a calm that belied the rapid beating of her heart, "the Dowager Duchess has requested your presence immediately regarding tomorrow's arrangements." The lie delivered with such conviction that Beatrice seized upon it gratefully, pulling free from Lord Pemberton's grasp, and moving to Eleanor's side with relief evident in every line of her trembling frame. The gentleman attempted to protest, his tone condescending as he addressed Eleanor with barely concealed contempt, suggesting that servants should not interfere in matters above their station, but Eleanor met his gaze steadily and replied with quiet firmness that any person of conscience would recognize when assistance was required, regardless of station, and she guided Beatrice back toward the house with a protective hand at the young woman's elbow, leaving Lord Pemberton fuming in the frozen garden. Lady Beatrice thanked her profusely once they were safely inside, her gratitude spilling over in rushed explanations of how the man had cornered her. How frightened she had been, how grateful she was for Eleanor's intervention, and Eleanor soothed her gently before ensuring she was safely delivered to her chambers, thinking the matter concluded until later that evening, when word came that the Duke wished to see her in the servants' hall, a summons so unprecedented that the entire below-stairs staff fell silent as Adrian Ashworth descended into their domain, his tall figure seeming to fill the low-ceilinged space as every servant rose in startled respect. He thanked Eleanor formally for her protection of his sister, his words correct and proper, but his eyes held an intensity that made her aware of every other person watching this extraordinary exchange, and when he asked why she had acted, she answered simply and honestly that it was the right thing to do, that one need not be noble by birth to recognize when nobility of action was required, and she saw something shift in his expression, some final barrier crumbling as he looked at her with undisguised wonder, as if she had just answered a question he had been asking himself for weeks without knowing he sought an answer. The moment stretched between them, charged with recognition and possibility, until Adrian nodded slowly and departed, leaving Eleanor trembling slightly as she felt the weight of curious and astonished gazes from her fellow servants. And though she feared she had overstepped some invisible line and invited consequences she could not predict, she could not regret speaking truth or acting with the integrity her father had taught her to value above all else, even as her heart whispered that something fundamental had shifted between herself and the Duke, something that could not now be taken back or ignored. The days following Eleanor's intervention on Lady Beatrice's behalf brought a shift in the household's rhythms, as subtle as the turning of winter toward its deepest cold, for Adrian began requesting Eleanor's presence for what he termed consultations about various textile projects throughout the estate, and though both of them recognized these pretexts for what they were, neither acknowledged aloud the transparent nature of his requests or the way their conversations gradually drifted from discussions of damask patterns and tapestry restoration toward territory far more personal and revealing. He asked about her past one grey afternoon as they stood before a series of faded wall hangings in the long gallery. His tone carefully casual, but his attention focused entirely on her response, and Eleanor found herself speaking of her father with a tenderness she rarely allowed herself to express, describing the country vicarage where she had grown up, surrounded by his extensive library, the genteel poverty that had marked her childhood after her mother's early death, and finally, the debts that had accumulated through her father's generous nature and poor financial judgment, debts that his death had left unpaid and threatening. She told him of the choice she had faced in those dark weeks following the funeral, a local merchant of comfortable means but coarse manner, who had offered marriage with the understanding that her acceptance would settle her father's obligations, and she admitted quietly that everyone had expected her to accept, that refusal had seemed not merely impractical but almost incomprehensibly proud, yet she had chosen honest work over a union that would have required her to pretend affection she could not feel, to spend her life as payment for her father's mistakes. Adrian listened with an intensity that made her aware of how rarely anyone had truly attended to her words, and when she finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment before sharing fragments of his own history, the woman he had intended to marry during his time in London, beautiful and accomplished and entirely focused on his title rather than his person, who had betrayed his private confidences to scandal sheets for money and social currency, whose mercenary nature he had discovered only after he had foolishly opened his heart to her deceptions. The parallel nature of their experiences created a bond neither had anticipated, this shared understanding of choosing dignity over ease, of valuing integrity even when that choice carried painful consequences, and Eleanor felt something shift between them as they stood in that cold gallery, surrounded by images of long-dead Ashworths, a recognition that they had both been shaped by similar crucibles and emerged with similar commitments to living truthfully, regardless of cost. Their conversations continued over the following weeks with increasing frequency and deepening intimacy, moving from the formal spaces of the house to quieter corners where they might speak without constant observation. And though Eleanor maintained all proper forms of address and deference, she could not prevent the gradual lowering of the careful walls she had built around her heart. Nor could she ignore the way Adrian looked at her now with undisguised warmth that made her breath catch and her pulse quicken with dangerous hope. The autumn deepened into winter, with that particular melancholy that marks the year's descent into darkness. And though Eleanor continued to enter through the servant's door each morning as she had for 3 years, arriving in the pre-dawn cold, with her breath misting in the air, and her hands tucked into her worn cloak against the biting wind, Adrian found himself increasingly drawn to the windows that overlooked that humble entrance, standing in the shadows of unlit rooms to watch her small figure cross the courtyard with her characteristic grace and quiet dignity, and he wrestled with an internal struggle that grew more acute with each passing day, for he knew with painful clarity that society would savage them both if he followed the impulses of his heart, knew that Eleanor would bear the worst of the cruelty as a woman who had dared to reach above her station, yet he found himself unable to extinguish the profound attraction he felt toward her integrity and quiet strength, toward the way she inhabited her life with such dignity, despite circumstances that might have crushed a lesser spirit. The pivotal evening arrived with a sudden snowstorm that transformed the estate into a realm of white silence, heavy flakes falling thick and fast as darkness descended earlier than usual, and Eleanor, who had been working late in the library on Christmas decorations at the Dowager's request, found herself effectively stranded by the weather's swift turn, the sensible course being to remain in the warm room until the worst of the storm passed, rather than venture through the treacherous courtyard to the servants' quarters. Adrian discovered her there quite by accident, or perhaps by some unconscious design his rational mind refused to acknowledge, entering the library in search of a volume and finding instead Eleanor silhouetted against the firelight, her dark hair catching glints of gold and copper as she reached up to hang garlands of evergreen, and the sight struck him with such force that he stood transfixed in the doorway, unable to speak or move as something fundamental shifted in his chest. She turned at the sound of his entrance and startled, nearly dropping the greenery in her hands, but he moved forward instinctively to steady her, and they found themselves standing closer than propriety allowed, close enough that he could see the rapid flutter of her pulse at her throat and the way her eyes widened with something that might have been fear or hope, or perhaps both intermingled. They spoke of inconsequential things at first, the weather and the decorations and the approaching Christmas season, but the conversation drifted as naturally as falling snow toward deeper waters, and when she mentioned a line from Wordsworth about nature's quiet beauty, he found himself reciting the full verse, and she completed the final lines with such perfect understanding of the poet's meaning that he felt a connection far more intimate than any physical touch, their voices weaving together in the firelit dimness as the storm raged outside and the house slept around them. The air between them grew charged with possibility as they discussed poetry and philosophy and the nature of beauty, standing too close now for any pretense of formal distance, and Adrian felt himself on the verge of speaking words that could not be unsaid, of reaching for her hand or touching her face, or confessing the feelings that had grown beyond his ability to contain, and he saw in her eyes that she felt the same dangerous pull toward a precipice they both knew they should not cross. But propriety intervened, as it always must, the clock striking the hour and breaking the spell, and Eleanor stepped back with visible effort, her voice unsteady as she murmured something about the lateness of the hour and her need to return to her quarters. And though Adrian wanted to ask her to stay, wanted to tell her that he no longer cared about the barriers between them or the scandal that would surely follow, he let her go because he was not yet quite brave enough to speak the truth aloud, and he watched her slip through the doorway into the snowy darkness while he remained by the dying fire, knowing that both of them would lie awake that night, fighting the same internal battle between what their hearts demanded and what their positions in the world's hierarchy seemed to require of them. Christmas arrived at Ashworth with all the glittering pageantry expected of a ducal household. The estate transformed into a realm of candlelight and evergreen boughs, of polished silver and crystal that caught the flames of hundreds of tapers, And Eleanor found herself working behind the scenes, as she had for 3 Christmases prior, her skilled fingers adjusting the drape of silk gowns and mending small tears in delicate fabrics, her presence invisible to the guests who swept through the grand rooms in their finery. And she told herself that this was proper, that this was her place, yet she could not prevent herself from stealing glimpses of the festivities through the servants' passage, watching through a crack in the doorway, as Adrian moved through the ballroom with that particular grace, born of privilege and training, dancing with young ladies whose breeding matched his own, whose conversation sparkled with practiced wit, whose beauty had been cultivated from birth for precisely such occasions. She witnessed Lady Charlotte Pemberton in particular, claiming his attention with obvious design, the woman's alabaster skin and golden hair creating a vision of perfection, as she laughed at something Adrian said, her hand resting on his arm with casual intimacy, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest as she acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding for weeks, the painful reality that she had fallen in love with a man so far above her station that even imagining a future together constituted a kind of madness, and she felt foolish for the private dreams she had harbored after that evening in the library, foolish for believing that the moments of connection they had shared meant anything beyond a duke's kindness to a skilled servant. She resolved in that moment to remember her place, to guard her heart more carefully, to accept that some boundaries existed not from cruelty, but from the immutable structure of the world they inhabited, and she withdrew from her vantage point with tears burning behind her eyes, returning to her small chamber in the servants' quarters, where she could not hear the music, or see the dancing, or torture herself further with impossible longings. Meanwhile, in the brilliance of the ballroom, Adrian endured the evening with barely concealed frustration, finding every conversation hollow and every smile false, comparing each woman he danced with to Eleanor's genuine warmth and discovering them all wanting, their beauty seeming artificial beside her natural grace, their practiced charm grating against his memory of her honest speech and thoughtful silences. When Lady Charlotte engineered a private moment in the conservatory, drawing him away from the crowd with a practiced combination of flattery and suggestion, when she pressed close to him in the shadows among the orange trees and tilted her face upward in clear invitation, he pulled away sharply as though burned, suddenly and completely certain of what he wanted and whom, understanding in that crystallizing instant that he could no longer pretend indifference to Eleanor or convince himself that duty and propriety mattered more than the profound connection he felt to a woman whose character far exceeded that of any lady in the glittering assembly, and he left Lady Charlotte standing alone among the potted palms, her expression shifting from surprise to fury as he strode away without explanation or apology, his mind already racing ahead to what he must do, what he must risk, to claim the only woman who had ever made him feel truly seen and valued for himself, rather than his title. New Year's morning arrived in 1848, with a crystalline cold that turned the world to ice and silver, the dawn sky pale as pearl, as Eleanor made her way across the frozen courtyard toward the servants' entrance, as she had done every morning for 3 years, her breath clouding in the frigid air and her worn cloak pulled tight against the biting wind. But this morning something was different, for as she approached the humble doorway, she saw a figure standing there in the shadows, and her heart seized in her chest when she recognized Adrian waiting in the cold without coat or gloves, his dark hair disheveled as though he had dressed in haste, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her steps falter and her courage nearly fail. He spoke before she could retreat, his voice rough from sleeplessness or emotion, or perhaps both, telling her that he could no longer pretend indifference, that the charade of distance between them had become unbearable, that every day he watched her enter through this door, while he remained on the other side of an invisible barrier, felt like a betrayal of something essential in his soul. And Eleanor attempted to protest the impossibility of what he seemed to be suggesting, stammering that he must not speak so, that his position and reputation demanded he choose appropriately, that she was only a seamstress without fortune or family or any of the advantages that should recommend a woman to his notice. He stepped closer then, close enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of his own sleepless night, and he asked her a direct question that cut through all pretense and propriety like a blade through silk. If there were no barriers of rank, Eleanor, if the world were different, and we were simply two people without the weight of titles and expectations, what would you want? But she could not let him finish the question, because to hear it spoken aloud would shatter the last of her defenses, and tears slipped down her cheeks unchecked as she stood trembling in the dawn light, unable to answer and unable to flee. He moved closer still, his voice dropping to something raw and desperate as he said, "I have had enough of appropriate matches and suitable arrangements, enough of women who want my title rather than my heart, enough of doors between us and walls between what is and what could be." And his declaration that he intended to court her properly, that he would face whatever consequences society demanded, but he would no longer deny what he felt, struck her with the force of a physical blow. She found her voice finally, though it shook with fear and longing intertwined, and she spoke of her terror for his reputation, for the scandal that would surely destroy his standing among his peers, and for the whispers and cruelty that would follow them both if he persisted in this madness. But he reached out and took her cold hands in his warm ones, and his quiet insistence carried the weight of absolute conviction as he said, "I would rather be truthful with you than comfortable with anyone else, would rather face scandal beside you than acceptance beside someone I do not love." And in that moment, standing in the frozen courtyard as the sun broke over the horizon and painted the ice with gold, Eleanor understood that he was offering her not just his heart but his whole life, asking her to trust that their love might be strong enough to weather the storm that was surely coming. And though fear still clutched at her chest, she felt something else rising beneath it, something that felt dangerously like hope. The crisis descended upon them with the swift brutality of a winter storm, for within days of Adrian's declaration in the courtyard, society learned of the Duke's intentions through servants' gossip and the sharp eyes of those who made it their business to monitor the activities of the great families, and the scandal erupted with a viciousness that shocked even Eleanor in her darkest imaginings, spreading through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs like wildfire through dry timber, fueled by Lady Charlotte's mother, who spared no effort in spreading vicious rumors that painted Eleanor as a scheming seductress who had deliberately entrapped the Duke through calculated manipulation and feminine wiles. The Dowager summoned Eleanor to her private sitting room with unusual formality, and though her expression held no cruelty, her counsel carried the weight of practicality, born from decades navigating society's treacherous waters, urging them to wait, to let the gossip die down before proceeding with any formal arrangement, reminding Adrian that his position required consideration of consequence and legacy. Yet Eleanor saw the conflict in the older woman's eyes, the tension between her genuine regard for Eleanor's character and her fear for her stepson's standing. Adrian's neighboring peers called upon him in steady succession, ostensibly for friendly visits, but actually to dissuade what they termed his madness, speaking in measured tones about duty and appropriate matches, about the damage to his family's reputation and the mockery he would face in Parliament. And though Adrian received them with icy politeness and dismissed their concerns with barely contained fury, Eleanor witnessed the toll these confrontations exacted, saw the tightness around his mouth and the shadows deepening beneath his eyes. She faced cruelty from both directions like a woman caught between opposing tides, for some servants resented what they perceived as her presumptuous elevation above her station, whispering that she had forgotten her place and grown too proud, calling her scheming and ambitious behind her back in the very halls where she had worked beside them for 3 years, while the gentry treated her with cutting disdain when she accompanied the Dowager on calls, their cold civility more painful than open hostility. Their pointed questions about her family and background designed to expose her inadequacy for the role she presumed to claim. The breaking point came on a grey February afternoon when Eleanor sought Adrian in his study, finding him standing at the window with shoulders bowed beneath invisible weight, and she spoke the words that had been building in her chest for days despite the agony they cost her, telling him that she would leave Ashworth, would release him from whatever promises he imagined he owed her, would save him from the ruin that loving her seemed destined to bring upon his head. Her voice steady, though her heart was shattering with each syllable. His response was immediate and anguished, spinning to face her with such raw pain in his eyes that she nearly lost her resolve, his voice breaking as he demanded, "You would save my reputation by destroying my heart? You would ask me to live the rest of my life knowing I was too cowardly to fight for the only woman I have ever truly loved?" She confessed then what she had never spoken aloud, the truth that had terrified her even as it sustained her through the worst of the gossip, telling him that she loved him with a depth that frightened her in its intensity. But love alone could not shield them from the consequences of defying every social convention that governed their world, could not protect him from the damage this scandal would inflict upon his family's name and his political influence. He crossed to her in 3 strides and took her hands in his with desperate tenderness, asking her to trust him, to give him time to show her that their love was worth any cost society might demand, promising that he would not let the small-minded cruelty of people who valued propriety over genuine feeling destroy what they had found together. His conviction absolute even as uncertainty clouded her vision, and though Eleanor wanted desperately to believe that love could triumph over the formidable barriers arrayed against them, fear held her captive like iron chains, whispering that hope itself was dangerous when the whole world seemed determined to prove it foolish. Adrian made his decision in the grey hours before dawn, 3 days after Eleanor's tearful declaration of love, rising from another sleepless night with a clarity of purpose that felt like steel forged in fire, and by mid-morning he had sent word throughout the estate that he required all tenants and servants to gather in the great hall at 2 o'clock for an announcement of utmost importance, a summons that sent ripples of speculation and anxiety through every corner of Ashworth, as people wondered whether the Duke intended to address the scandal that had consumed the household for weeks, or perhaps to announce Eleanor's departure as so many had predicted. Eleanor herself received the summons with trembling hands, fearing that Adrian had decided to yield to the pressure of society's disapproval, that he had come to see the wisdom in the Dowager's counsel, to wait or perhaps to abandon their impossible attachment altogether, and she dressed with particular care in a simple grey gown that seemed appropriate for whatever ending this gathering might bring, her fingers shaking as she fastened the buttons, and her heart beating against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom, or perhaps for the mercy of a swift conclusion to this agony of uncertainty. The great hall filled slowly as the appointed hour approached, tenant farmers in their rough woolens standing awkwardly beside housemaids in crisp aprons, footmen and grooms shifting uncomfortably near the walls, while the upper servants claimed positions of slightly greater prominence, and Eleanor entered last to find every eye turning toward her, with expressions ranging from curiosity to resentment to something that might have been pity, and she stood at the back of the crowd with her spine straight and her chin raised despite the terror coursing through her veins, determined to face whatever came with the same dignity that had sustained her through 3 years of honest labor in this house. Adrian entered through the main doors with the Dowager at his side, his expression grave but his bearing resolute, and he took his position on the raised dais at the hall's far end, where generations of Ashworths had addressed their people in times of crisis or celebration, and the murmuring crowd fell silent as he surveyed them with eyes that seemed to see each individual face and measure the character behind it. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly to every corner of the vast space, steady and strong, and utterly uncompromising in its conviction. He began by acknowledging the gossip that had circulated regarding his intentions toward Eleanor Hartley, confirming that yes, the rumors were true, he did indeed intend to make her his wife, and a collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd like wind across a wheat field. But he raised his hand for silence and continued speaking, his words falling like hammer blows upon the anvil of their expectations and prejudices. He spoke of Eleanor's character with a specificity that made her cheeks burn, detailing the integrity she had shown in her work, the kindness she had extended to those beneath her own station despite having so little herself, the honor and dignity with which she had conducted herself, even as others whispered cruel speculation about her motives and her morals, and he acknowledged his love for her before these witnesses with a frankness that would have been shocking had his sincerity been any less evident, stating plainly that he had chosen to spend his life with this woman and would marry her regardless of society's approval or disapproval. Then he issued his challenge, his voice rising with passion as he declared, "I have known women born to every advantage who possessed a fraction of her grace, as women raised in luxury who demonstrated none of her compassion, women with impeccable pedigrees who lacked even a measure of her genuine nobility of spirit. And I tell you now that birth is an accident of fate, while character is a choice made daily through actions great and small, and I choose to spend my life with a woman who has chosen nobility in every action, regardless of the cost to herself. and the words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, daring anyone present to contradict him or to question his judgment in this most personal of matters. Eleanor stood transfixed, tears streaming down her face unchecked as she watched him risk everything, not in the privacy of whispered declarations, but here in public view, staking his reputation and his standing on his faith in her worth. And she saw the shock on faces around her gradually transforming into something else, some combination of grudging respect and wonder that their duke would speak so plainly about matters, the quality typically veiled in euphemism and careful propriety. And when Adrian's eyes finally found hers across the crowded hall, the love and determination she saw there nearly brought her to her knees with the overwhelming force of gratitude and unworthiness, and fierce, desperate hope intertwined. The turning point arrived unexpectedly on a rain-swept morning 10 days after Adrian's public declaration. When the bishop of the diocese appeared at Ashworth's gates in his modest carriage, unannounced, and requesting immediate audience with both the Duke and Miss Hartley, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with dread as she was summoned to the library, where Bishop Thornbury waited, with Adrian standing tense and watchful beside the window. The bishop was an imposing figure despite his advanced years, tall and lean with penetrating grey eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth beneath, and Eleanor knew him to be an old friend of Adrian's late father, who had baptized Adrian himself and held considerable influence among the traditional families of the region, making his opinion potentially decisive in swaying those who remained uncertain about this controversial match. He greeted Eleanor with grave courtesy but no warmth, requesting a private interview with her alone, and though Adrian clearly wished to protest, Eleanor touched his arm gently and nodded her acceptance, understanding that she must face this examination without his protection if her own character was to be properly measured. The bishop dismissed Adrian with a firmness that brooked no argument, and once they were alone, he settled into a chair with deliberate slowness and studied Eleanor with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare of all artifice. And when he finally spoke, his questions were direct and probing, designed to expose any hidden motives or misunderstandings about the responsibilities she would assume as Duchess of Thornfield. He asked her plainly what she sought in this marriage, whether she understood the scrutiny and demands that would follow her all her days, whether she possessed the strength to withstand the cruelty of those who would never accept her elevation, and Eleanor answered with the honesty that had become her only defense against a world determined to doubt her integrity, telling him that she loved Adrian with a depth that frightened her, but that she would release him tomorrow if she believed that love would ultimately harm him or diminish him in any way. She acknowledged without shame that she lacked the training and polish expected of a duchess, having spent her formative years in a country vicarage and the past 3 years working with her hands in service, but she possessed determination to learn whatever was required and genuine humility about her own limitations, and she sought neither fortune nor title, but only the right to stand beside the man she loved and to build a life of shared purpose and partnership. The bishop's expression remained unreadable throughout her responses, offering no indication whether her words found favor or confirmed his worst suspicions, and Eleanor felt exhaustion settling into her bones from weeks of emotional siege, from the constant strain of defending her character and her motives to an endless succession of skeptical judges. Then, after a silence that stretched until Eleanor thought she might shatter from the tension, Bishop Thornbury rose from his chair with unexpected grace and regarded her with something approaching warmth in those penetrating eyes, and he spoke words that would shift the trajectory of public opinion more powerfully than any of Adrian's passionate declarations, saying in his authoritative voice that carried the weight of decades of moral leadership, "Your Grace, I have met many duchesses in my time, women born to privilege and trained from infancy for their elevated positions, and I tell you now with complete sincerity that few possess such clarity of purpose or humility of spirit as I have witnessed here today. And I believe the Duke of Thornfield has chosen well indeed, and I shall make my support of this union known throughout the diocese." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at this unexpected vindication, this affirmation from a source whose judgment could not be dismissed as mere romantic partiality, and when Adrian was readmitted to the library and saw the bishop's hand resting paternally on Eleanor's shoulder, the hope that blazed in his expression mirrored the fragile joy beginning to take root in her own battered heart, and she understood that they had cleared a crucial hurdle on the long road toward acceptance and legitimacy. As winter yielded to early spring, and the first brave crocuses pushed through the thawing earth around Ashworth's gardens, preparations began in earnest for a wedding that had once seemed impossible. Yet Adrian insisted upon one symbolic act before any other arrangements could proceed, summoning the estate's master mason and issuing instructions that shocked the entire household into stunned silence. He ordered the servants' entrance through which Eleanor had passed for 3 years, her feet wearing a familiar path across those cold stones in darkness and in light, to be formally sealed with stone and mortar, the doorway filled in permanently so that no one could ever again use that passage. And he commissioned a brass plaque to be installed on the spot where the door had stood, bearing the inscription, "Dignity requires no separate doors," words that would stand as testament to his convictions and his refusal to maintain the artificial divisions that had kept them apart for so long. On the morning after the work was completed, Eleanor arrived at dawn as habit dictated, her body moving along the accustomed route before her mind fully registered the change, and she stopped short when she found smooth stone where the familiar entrance had been, her hand rising to touch the plaque with trembling fingers as she read the words engraved there, and tears blurred her vision as the full meaning of Adrian's gesture settled into her heart with the weight of a sacred vow. She heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to find Adrian himself approaching from the main entrance, dressed impeccably despite the early hour, and he extended his hand to her with grave formality, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air as he said, "Miss Hartley, would you do me the honor of entering Ashworth as my acknowledged betrothed, through the doors befitting your position as the future Duchess of Thornfield?" Eleanor felt her knees weaken at the magnitude of this moment, this crossing of a threshold that was both literal and symbolic, and she placed her hand in his with a sense of stepping forward into a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. And together they ascended the marble steps of the main entrance, while household staff emerged from doorways and windows, drawn by some invisible summons to witness this historic transformation. The great doors stood open before them like welcoming arms, and as Eleanor crossed that threshold on Adrian's arm, she heard the sound of applause beginning tentatively from the assembled servants and growing stronger as the family members joined in. And she saw Mrs. Hartwell openly weeping with joy, and young Molly the chambermaid beaming with pride, and even the stern Mr. Pemberton the butler, nodding his approval of this unprecedented breach of convention that somehow felt more right than any rigid adherence to tradition could have been. Later that same day, in the grand salon where Eleanor had once worked in careful silence while the family entertained guests, Adrian formally asked her to marry him before assembled witnesses, producing a ring that had belonged to his birth mother, a delicate gold band set with sapphires the color of a summer sky, and his voice shook slightly as he said, "Eleanor Hartley, you have shown me what true nobility means. You have restored my faith in genuine feeling and honest hearts, and I ask you now before God and these witnesses to be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things that matter." And Eleanor's yes rang clear and strong through the magnificent room, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. And when Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her into his arms for their first kiss as betrothed lovers, the tenderness and promise in that embrace spoke of a love tested by doubt and opposition, and emerging stronger for having endured. A love that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead, and Eleanor allowed herself at last to believe fully in this impossible miracle, to embrace the joy she had spent so long holding at arm's length, to trust that she was worthy of this extraordinary man's devotion, and capable of rising to meet the demands of the life they would build together. The wedding preparations revealed class tensions with a clarity that no amount of goodwill could entirely soften, for while the bishop's endorsement and Adrian's unwavering determination had secured Eleanor's position in principle, the practical reality of planning a ceremony that would unite a duke with a former seamstress exposed fault lines that ran deep through the bedrock of English society. Adrian's paternal aunt, Lady Georgiana Ashworth, sent a coldly formal letter declining to attend and stating plainly that she considered the match a disgrace to the family name that would be whispered about in drawing rooms for generations, and her refusal emboldened others who had been wavering in their judgment, resulting in a steady trickle of polite regrets from families who preferred not to be associated with such an unprecedented breach of social order. Yet for every door that closed against them, another opened with unexpected warmth, And it was Lady Beatrice who emerged as Eleanor's fiercest champion, declaring at a tea party within hearing of several influential matrons that she wanted no friends who could not recognize virtue, regardless of its origin, and that her future sister-in-law possessed more genuine nobility in her smallest finger than many titled ladies possessed in their entire artificial persons. The Dowager Duchess, who had maintained a careful neutrality even after giving her qualified blessing, began to warm more genuinely as she observed Eleanor's genuine care for Adrian and her determination to honor the Ashworth legacy rather than simply claiming its privileges, and she remarked privately to her stepson that she had initially feared he was acting from rebellion against his own class, but now believed he had found something far rarer than an appropriate match. He had found a true partner who would strengthen rather than diminish what the family represented at its best. The wedding preparations proceeded with a strange mixture of traditional grandeur and deliberate simplification, for Adrian insisted on conducting the ceremony in the estate's private chapel rather than in the cathedral where his ancestors had wed for centuries. Understanding that a more intimate gathering would spare Eleanor the ordeal of facing rows of skeptical faces and would allow them to surround themselves only with those who genuinely supported their union. Then came a moment that nearly shattered Eleanor's hard-won composure entirely, when the household servants gathered in the main hall one evening and presented her with a gift they had created collectively, a beautifully sewn handkerchief of the finest linen on which each member of the staff had contributed a single stitch, creating an intricate pattern that represented their shared labor and their blessing on her transformation from colleague to mistress. Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper who had supervised Eleanor's work for 3 years and had witnessed her unfailing courtesy even when exhausted or treated dismissively, spoke for them all with tears gleaming in her shrewd old eyes, saying in her gruff voice that carried genuine emotion beneath its practical tone, "You have never forgotten where you came from, miss. Never put on airs or pretended you were born to what you're stepping into now. And we trust you won't forget us when you become Her Grace. Won't lose sight of what it means to work with your hands and earn your bread through honest labor." Eleanor accepted the handkerchief with trembling fingers and made a promise through her tears that she would remember both. The servant's stairs she had climbed in darkness and cold, and the kindness that had been shown her there, that she would never allow her elevated position to separate her from an understanding of the struggles and dignity of those who served, and in that moment the divisions between mistress and maid dissolved into something more profound, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the arbitrary boundaries of birth and station. The wedding day arrived with spring blossoms opening across Ashworth's gardens like small white prayers ascending toward a sky. Of such crystalline blue, it seemed heaven itself had bent closer to witness this union that defied convention and chose love over propriety. And Eleanor stood in the dowager's chambers, wearing the restored heirloom veil she had once mended with trembling hands as a mere seamstress, the delicate Brussels lace cascading over her shoulders in intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories of all the brides who had worn it before her, though none had traveled quite so far to reach this moment of transformation. The ceremony in the estate's private chapel was intimate by design, the ancient stone walls holding only those whose support was genuine rather than obligatory, and as Eleanor walked down the short aisle on the arm of Mr. Pemberton, the butler who had agreed to give her away in the absence of living family, she felt the weight of sympathetic gazes and understood that every person present had chosen to stand as witness, despite the social costs such allegiance might exact, and their courage strengthened her own trembling resolve. Adrian waited at the altar in his formal attire, but it was his face that held Eleanor's attention, the naked emotion visible in his eyes as he watched her approach, and she saw there no trace of doubt or hesitation, only a certainty that steadied her racing heart and reminded her that this love was worth every risk they had taken, every door they had closed behind them, to step forward into unknown territory together. When the time came for vows, Adrian spoke words he had written himself rather than merely repeating the traditional phrases, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chapel as he said, "Eleanor, I have learned that truth can be found in unexpected places, that genuine nobility has nothing to do with titles or birth, and I vow before God and these witnesses that I choose to spend my life loving you for who you are, rather than what convention says you should represent, that I will honor your strength and your gentleness, of your wisdom earned through struggle, and your grace maintained despite hardship." Eleanor's own vows trembled from her lips with equal conviction, her promise to honor the responsibilities she now assumed, to serve the Ashworth legacy with the same dedication she had once brought to her needlework, to stand beside Adrian as partner rather than ornament, and to remember always that their union represented not the elevation of one person, but the joining of two souls who had recognized in each other something precious and rare. The moment they were pronounced husband and wife, Adrian drew her close and kissed her with tender reverence, and when they turned to face their guests, he did not lead her toward a discreet side exit, but instead walked her directly down the main aisle, with their joined hands raised slightly, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of defiance toward all those who had doubted the rightness of this match, and the applause that erupted was enthusiastic and heartfelt, rising toward the vaulted ceiling like a benediction. The wedding breakfast that followed broke yet another convention, for Adrian had insisted that select members of the household staff be included among the family guests. So Mrs. Hartwell sat at table beside Lady Beatrice, and young Molly the chambermaid found herself addressed respectfully by the bishop himself, and in this mingling of stations there was a preview of the kind of household Eleanor and Adrian intended to create together, one where dignity was accorded to all who demonstrated character and where artificial barriers would be challenged at every opportunity. The joy that filled those hours was genuine and hard-won, and therefore infinitely precious, sweeter for having been earned through patience and courage, rather than simply claimed as a birthright. And as Eleanor looked around at the assembled company, at Adrian's hand warm in hers, and the dowager's approving smile, and Lady Beatrice's delighted grin, she felt herself finally release the last vestiges of fear and doubt, allowing herself to fully inhabit this moment of triumph and transformation, to believe completely in the future they would build together one deliberate choice at a time. The wedding night arrived with a tenderness that transcended the physical realm, for Adrian understood with rare sensitivity that Eleanor stood at the threshold of vulnerability far deeper than mere intimacy of flesh. She was entering spaces that were now legitimately hers, yet which carried the weight of 3 years' worth of boundaries and prohibitions, and he guided her through those hours with patience that spoke of genuine love rather than mere desire, his touch reverent as he helped her from the elaborate wedding gown whose fastenings she had sewn herself in quiet evening hours, his whispered assurances gentle against her, trembling, as he reminded her that she belonged here, not through conquest or scheme, but through the simple truth of their love. The days that followed brought adjustments both small and profound, for Eleanor discovered that being served by those who had once been her peers created a strangeness she had not anticipated, and when Molly the chambermaid brought her morning tea with downcast eyes and trembling hands, Eleanor felt the distance between them like a physical ache, and had to resist the urge to take the tray herself and sit beside the girl as equals, yet she understood gradually that kindness need not erase hierarchy entirely. It could instead transform hierarchy into something gentler, could make service feel less like subjugation and more like honored contribution. There came an evening, perhaps a fortnight into their marriage, when Eleanor stood in the Duchess's chambers, her chambers now, staring at her reflection in the gilt-edged mirror and feeling the weight of expectations pressing down upon her shoulders like stones. And when Adrian found her there with tears sliding silently down her cheeks, she confessed in a broken whisper that she felt overwhelmed by the demands of her new position, terrified that she would fail him or embarrass the family name or prove that all those who had called her presumptuous had been right all along. His response came without hesitation but with infinite gentleness as he turned her to face him and cupped her face in his hands, saying with quiet conviction that carried the force of absolute truth, "You need not transform overnight, Eleanor. You need not become someone other than who you are. For I did not fall in love with a duchess or with some idealized vision of what a woman in this position should be. I fell in love with Eleanor Hartley, who stitched beauty with patient hands and walked through cold mornings with quiet dignity. And I ask only that you let her grow into this role at her own pace. Let her bring to it the same integrity and thoughtfulness she has brought to everything else." Their physical intimacy deepened alongside their emotional connection as the weeks passed, creating between them a bond that transcended the separate worlds from which they had come. And when they hosted their first dinner party as Duke and Duchess, Eleanor's nervousness manifested in trembling hands that nearly upset a wine glass, Yet her genuine warmth and her sincere interest in each guest's concerns ultimately won over several skeptical attendees who had come prepared to find fault, but discovered instead a hostess whose lack of aristocratic polish was more than compensated by authentic hospitality that made each person feel genuinely valued rather than merely acknowledged. Months passed, and summer brought its golden warmth to Ashworth, transforming the gardens into riots of color and filling the long days with light that seemed to linger as though reluctant to yield to evening's gentle shadows. And in those sun-drenched weeks, Eleanor grew into her role as Duchess with a determination and grace that surprised even those who had championed her cause. For she approached her new responsibilities with the same meticulous care she had once brought to her needlework, studying the estate's accounts and histories, learning the names and circumstances of every tenant family, understanding that true authority came not from demanding deference, but from earning respect through genuine care for those whose lives depended upon the Ashworth stewardship. She established a program to provide education and skills training for young women in the village, drawing from her own experience of needing to support herself when fortune had stripped away every other option, and the workshop she created in one of the estate's unused buildings became a place where girls who might otherwise have faced desperate choices could learn trades that would grant them independence and dignity, could acquire the skills that would allow them to navigate the world with heads held high, regardless of what circumstances life might impose upon them. Adrian supported her initiatives not merely in private encouragement, but in public endorsement, speaking at the workshop's opening ceremony about how his Duchess understood the challenges facing ordinary people because she had lived them rather than merely observed them from aristocratic distance, and his words carried a quiet pride that made Eleanor's heart swell with gratitude for this man who had chosen her not despite her humble origins, but in part because of the perspective those origins had granted her. Their partnership deepened through those summer months into something that transcended the romantic love that had first drawn them together, becoming instead a collaboration of shared values and complementary strengths, so that when difficult decisions arose regarding estate management or tenant disputes, they would sit together in the study, discussing options with an easy communication that revealed how thoroughly their minds had learned to work in harmony, how completely they had become partners in every sense, rather than merely husband and wife, bound by legal contract and physical attraction. There came an evening in late August when Eleanor sat at Adrian's desk reviewing correspondence, while he stood by the window watching the sun set over fields golden with ripening grain, and in the comfortable silence between them, she felt a wave of contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This sense of having found not just love, but home, not just acceptance, but true belonging, and when she rose to join him at the window, when he turned and drew her into his arms with unconscious tenderness, she whispered against his chest that she had news, that the physician had confirmed what she had already suspected in her heart, that come spring they would welcome their first child. And his response was everything she could have hoped for, his face transforming with wonder and joy as he held her closer, his hand coming to rest protectively over the place where new life grew, his voice rough with emotion as he spoke of the future they would build together, the family they would create, the legacy of love and dignity they would pass to the next generation. And Eleanor found herself marveling at how dramatically her life had transformed, how the woman who had once entered through servants' doors now stood in her husband's arms, planning for the birth of a child who would carry both their names and their shared commitment to living with integrity, regardless of what society might demand or expect. The final test arrived with the cruel precision of winter's first frost. For Lady Charlotte's mother, embittered by her daughter's failed suit and nursing the wound of social humiliation that came from watching a mere seamstress claim the prize her own child had been denied, spread through the drawing rooms of society a vicious rumor that Eleanor had trapped the Duke through calculated seduction, had used her position as seamstress to gain access to his private chambers, and had employed wiles both shameful and deliberate to ensnare a man whose grief and isolation had made him vulnerable to feminine manipulation. The scandal reignited with a ferocity that shocked even those who had initially opposed the match, for the whispers carried an insidious quality that transformed Eleanor's genuine virtue into evidence of cunning, her quiet dignity into proof of artifice, her very reluctance to accept Adrian's courtship twisted into the performance of a skilled actress who knew that resistance would only inflame desire. Eleanor, now 6 months with child and carrying the visible evidence of their union beneath gowns that could no longer entirely conceal her condition, faced the cruelty at a public assembly held to benefit the local hospital, an event she had helped organize and could not avoid, without appearing to acknowledge guilt. And as she moved through the gathered society, she felt the weight of whispered innuendo like physical blows, saw women she had worked to befriend turn their faces away or regard her with expressions that mingled pity with contempt, heard fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly when she approached only to resume in hissed whispers once she had passed. Adrian witnessed one particularly cruel moment when a group of ladies, including Lady Charlotte herself, formed a deliberate barrier that forced Eleanor to walk around them, saw how his wife maintained her composure, despite the hurt that flickered in her eyes like candle flame in wind, observed the way she placed one hand protectively over her swollen belly, as though shielding their unborn child from the poison of their malice, and something in him that had remained civilized and constrained suddenly broke free with the force of long-suppressed rage. He strode to the center of the assembly hall and called for silence with a voice that carried the full weight of ducal authority, then delivered a speech that would be remembered and repeated in drawing rooms across 3 counties, his words cutting through pretense with surgical precision as he spoke of the cowardice inherent in attacking a woman's character from envy rather than evidence, of the particular cruelty of those who would persecute someone for the crime of rising above the station into which accident of birth had placed her, and then he issued his challenge with eyes that swept the room and lingered deliberately on Lady Charlotte and her mother. My wife has shown more grace in the face of your cruelty than many of you have shown in lives of ease and privilege. She has borne your whispers and your snubs with a dignity that shames those who fancy themselves her betters, and if you cannot accord her the respect her position and her character both deserve, then you are not welcome in our home or our lives, for I would rather live in honest isolation with a woman of genuine virtue than in false society with those who mistake viciousness for wit and cruelty for sophistication. The room fell into a silence so profound that the ticking of the mantel clock seemed loud as thunder, and Eleanor stood frozen with tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks, tears born not of shame, but of overwhelming gratitude for this man, who had chosen her not in private romance but in public declaration, who defended her not with gentle words in quiet moments but with fierce conviction before witnesses. Then something unexpected occurred that would shift the tide of opinion more decisively than any speech, for the bishop's wife, a woman whose moral authority was unquestioned and whose approval carried weight even among the most traditional elements of society, rose from her seat and crossed the room with deliberate steps, and when she reached Eleanor, she drew the younger woman into an embrace that communicated both comfort and public endorsement, saying in a voice meant to carry, "Your Grace, I have watched you navigate these months with a grace that speaks to the quality of your character, and any who doubt you doubt their own ability to recognize virtue when it stands before them." Others followed then, slowly at first and then with gathering momentum, women who had been uncertain or afraid to show support, now emboldened by the bishop's wife's example, and though some, including Lady Charlotte and her mother, departed in cold fury, the assembly ended not in Eleanor's humiliation, but in her vindication, the scandal extinguished by the simple power of those willing to stand publicly for truth against the seductive ease of malicious gossip. Autumn returned to Ashworth with its familiar palette of copper and gold, the trees shedding their leaves like memories drifting to earth, and with the season came Eleanor's time of confinement in those final weeks when she withdrew from public view according to custom, though Adrian remained constantly near, his anxiety barely concealed behind expressions of calm reassurance that fooled no one who knew him well. The labor began on an October night, when frost silvered the windows and the wind carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, and what the midwife had promised would be a straightforward delivery became instead an ordeal that stretched through the dark hours and into the grey dawn. Eleanor's cries penetrating the thick walls of the birthing chamber to reach Adrian, where he paced the corridor outside like a caged animal, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails drew blood from his palms. The dowager sat with him in vigil, her own face drawn with worry, and when the physician emerged at one point to request additional supplies, when Adrian saw the gravity in the man's expression and heard the careful neutrality in his voice as he spoke of complications. Something in the Duke's chest constricted with a terror more profound than any he had known, a desperate awareness that all his wealth and position meant nothing against the arbitrary cruelty of nature, that he could lose her despite having fought so hard to make her his. He fled to the chapel then, this man who had not prayed with true fervor since childhood, and knelt before the altar with tears streaming down his face, offering bargains to a god he was not certain existed, willing to trade title, fortune, even his own life for Eleanor's survival, for the chance to hold her again and tell her that she mattered more than any child they might create, that he would rather have her alone than lose her in the bearing of his heir. The dawn strengthened beyond the stained glass windows, painting colored patterns across the stone floor, and still he prayed until finally, mercifully, he heard footsteps and looked up to see Mrs. Hartwell's tear-stained but smiling face, heard her voice break as she told him that her grace had been delivered of a daughter, and that both mother and child lived, and his relief was so overwhelming that he remained on his knees, his body shaking with sobs that combined gratitude and lingering fear, and the profound humility of having been granted what he had no right to expect. When they finally allowed him into the chamber, he found Eleanor propped against pillows, her face pale and marked with exhaustion, but alive, wonderfully alive, and in her arms a tiny creature with a shock of dark hair and impossibly small fingers that curled reflexively when he touched them, and the emotion that flooded through him as he looked at his wife and daughter was something beyond naming, a mixture of love and awe and protective fierceness that remade him in that moment into something he had never been before, into a father willing to move heaven and earth to keep these two souls safe. The christening came 6 weeks later, when Eleanor had regained her strength, the ceremony held in the same chapel where Adrian had prayed for her survival, and they named their daughter Grace Eleanor Ashworth in deliberate acknowledgement of the unearned mercy that had brought her parents together, and the woman whose courage had made such love possible, and the gathered witnesses represented the full spectrum of Ashworth's community, nobility standing alongside tenant farmers and house servants in a gathering that would have been unthinkable before Eleanor's arrival, but which now seemed natural and right. The dowager held her granddaughter with obvious love, the baby small and perfect in her arms, and when she looked at Eleanor, her expression held none of the reserve that had once marked their interactions, only warmth and genuine affection, as she said, "You have brought light back to this house, my dear. You have reminded us all what truly matters, and my stepson chose wisely when he chose his heart over society's expectations." And Eleanor felt in that moment the final dissolution of any lingering sense of not belonging, the complete certainty that she had found home, not just in Adrian's love, but in this place, and among these people who had learned to see past the accident of her birth, to recognize the substance of her character. 5 years had passed since Eleanor Hartley first entered Ashworth as a seamstress, arriving in darkness through the servants' entrance with her sewing basket and her quiet dreams, and 3 years since she had entered it as a bride, through doors flung wide in defiance of convention, and in the interval between those entrances she had been transformed, not merely in title, but in the deepest substance of her being, and had grown from a woman who moved through the world with careful steps designed to avoid notice, into one who walked with the confidence born of knowing she belonged exactly where she stood. The autumn morning found her in the great hall, overseeing preparations for the harvest festival, her voice calm and assured as she directed servants, who now deferred to her judgment without the hesitation that had marked those early months. And watching from the doorway, Adrian felt his chest tighten with familiar wonder at the sight of her. This woman who had once believed herself unworthy of anything beyond honest work, and who now managed one of England's great estates, with a grace that made it seem effortless, though he knew the effort she had invested in learning every tradition and responsibility. Their children played in the garden, visible through the tall windows. Grace, now a spirited child of 4, with her mother's dark hair and her father's determination, and Thomas, barely 2 years old, and already showing signs of the stubborn independence that seemed to be the Ashworth inheritance. And when Eleanor glanced up and caught her husband watching, she smiled with the easy intimacy of those who have built something real together through patience and deliberate choice. The former servant's entrance, that narrow door through which Eleanor had passed in cold and darkness for 3 years, had been transformed, according to her vision, into a bright workshop where young women from the village and surrounding farms came to learn skills that might save them from the desperate choices poverty too often demanded, where they learned not just needlework but bookkeeping and reading, and the confidence to imagine futures beyond the limitations their births seemed to impose. And Eleanor taught there herself 2 mornings each week, her hands demonstrating stitches, while her words offered something more valuable than technique. That afternoon, a young seamstress arrived seeking employment, a girl of perhaps 18 with worn shoes and anxious eyes, and Eleanor greeted her personally at the main entrance, extending her hand to help the girl up the marble steps as she said gently, "In this house, there are no separate doors for those who work honestly. You will enter where anyone enters and be valued for the quality of your character and your craft." And the girl's expression of stunned gratitude reminded Eleanor so powerfully of her own younger self that she felt tears prick her eyes. Adrian joined them then, placing his hand at the small of Eleanor's back with the casual affection that still made her heart quicken. And together they welcomed this newest member of their household, these two who had learned that love, which transcends the arbitrary boundaries of birth and wealth, is the truest nobility, that patience and courage can indeed transform what seems impossible into something not merely possible but inevitable and right. And as the girl was led away to begin her work, Eleanor leaned into her husband's shoulder and whispered her gratitude for a life she had never dared to imagine, and he had never stopped believing they deserved. Dear friend who has walked with us through this story, perhaps you have known the weight of doors that seem closed to you, the ache of loving someone or wanting something that the world insists you have no right to claim, the exhaustion of living within boundaries drawn by accident rather than merit. And if so, then know this: the truest measure of any person lies not in the circumstances of their birth, but in the choices they make when tested. Not in the doors through which they enter, but in the grace with which they walk once inside. And though the world may insist on separations between worthy and unworthy, noble and common, possible and impossible, love recognizes no such distinctions, and neither should you. May you find the courage to cross thresholds that once seemed forbidden, to claim the love and the life your character deserves rather than the limitations your circumstances suggest. And may you discover, as Eleanor and Adrian did, that the most profound transformations begin with the simple audacity of believing you deserve more than separate doors, and that those who truly see you will fling those doors wide in welcome. Sleep well with the knowledge that nobility of spirit matters infinitely more than nobility of birth. And if you found meaning in this story, then I invite you to explore more tales of love that transcends boundaries, of courage that defies convention, and of hearts that choose authenticity over ease, here on this channel, where every story reminds us that the barriers between us are far more fragile than we imagine, and far less important than the connections we forge when we dare to reach across them.